Henry McCarthy, educator, poet, actor, and host of Poets and Writers WEHC 90.7, will share about his life and experiences. He is currently a resident of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and Abingdon, Virginia. He spent his childhood in the mountains of East Tennessee and Western North Carolina, and later moved to the Piedmont, where he grew up playing ball and being influenced by Wake Forest University. McCarthy will share stories about the over 350 interviews he has conducted for Poets and Writers with Ivy Sheppard, primarily from the Southeast, including Barbara Kingsolver, Pat Conroy, and Wake Forest personalities Ed and Emily Wilson. McCarthy's latest book of poems is Never Read a How-To Book, Poems by Henry McCarthy. In addition, Henry will also speak about his international work in China, prison reform, a short foray into real estate, acting, politics, and his family. And Henry, I'm going to start you off, and thank you again for doing this for Special Collections.
Well, Tanya, I want to thank you and Wake Forest so much for being so kind and indulging me and letting me speak about my life. So I thank you very much for this, and you do excellent work there in Special Collections. So thank you, Tanya Zanis Belcher. Thank you so much. Yes, last time I did a presentation there in Special Collections, and I got through the early part of my life, and we had a great time, as you know, Tanya. And several people said, well, there were other aspects that we wanted you to talk about, and several people mentioned my poetry. So I have had, I will turn in October, I will be 80 years old, which I think is kind of a transition mark. And I want to start today, before I talk about the shows, because I really want to get into the history of Poets and Writers, WEHC 90.7, and how we came to do this, because it is definitely, folks would agree, had an impact in terms of sharing poetry and literature. But before I do this, there's a little book that Patty and I put together called Never Read a How-To Book. And it became, quite frankly, it has become very popular. And it's now in some special collections and also on the internet for sale as a rare book. So this will explain to you, this is called Never Read a How-To Book. And first of all, it will explain to you a little bit about my life. And I think poetry does so much to conceptualize our lives. And you know, Hemingway said, tell it true, tell the truth and tell it true. Now, Emily Dickinson, tell the truth, but tell it slant. I'm going to try to do both today. So this first poem is called Wild Bill, and it's about my brother-in-law and how Winston-Salem was an influence. And definitely Wake Forest was an influence on me. Wild Bill, he came to the city of tobacco with a teenage bride and the soul of a mountain boy from the Blue Ridge. For 35 years, he drove an 18-wheeler, smoked, drank, and loved his wife and family. Retired with nothing left in his bank account, abandoned by the Teamsters Union. Lou Gehrig's disease came calling one winter. By spring, he was in intensive care. I patted his shoulder and said, hang in there, Bill. And his reply, I give it a good shot, and I ain't gonna make it. Could you put on some George Jones? My wife, 2 AA buddies, and I stroked his shoulders. Wild Bill took 3 shallow breaths, the heart monitor flatlined, and George Jones sang, he stopped loving her today. That's a true story. Also, several poems that I wanted to read to you today. The next one is Millard, and Millard was a life inmate that I met when I was doing prison reform. And I will talk briefly about prison reform today, but I spent 2 years with an organization called Offender Aid and Restoration. And we were not a bureaucracy. We were an upfront organization, and we were in and out the jails and all the prisons in the state of Virginia. And I even went in undercover to learn more about the conditions and what an inmate went through. But I met many, many characters. Smokey, he wanted me to go help beat up his girlfriend's boyfriend when we got out, but I declined. And he didn't pay me a compliment because as he he was a trustee, he said, I've been watching you and you know how to keep your mouth shut. Well, I'm not sure he knew me that well, but anyway, Millard, I want to share this with you. If you go to Blowing Rock, North Carolina, and you pass the garden there will be a plaque to Police Chief Green, who was killed in the line of action. So Millard is the inmate, and he got life for that. And this is a poem about him. The one-eyed, gray-haired man sits in his cell, fingering the 8-inch blade, steel blade, waiting, cat-like, for the young punk trustee to bring his food so that he can spring from his metal cot, and as a leather craftsman, flick the blade into the neck of his prey. Well, that's a true story. I went into the Washington County Jail one morning, and I walked the cell block, and I started up to talk with Millard. He said he wanted to see me. And I walked to the cell block, and I looked at him, and he had one eye because he'd had the other eye knocked out in Central Prison down in Raleigh. And he said, Henry, I've done made up my mind. I'm going to take that young punk trustee out. And I said, you're going to take him out? And I knew what he meant. He said, yeah, he insulted me. So I talked with Millard, and Millard reached under his cot, and that's why I wrote this poem, and he pulled out a large steel blade knife. And he said, this is what I'm going to do it with. So I went on around the corner, and the young trustee said, could you help me? I didn't know who that old man was before I insulted him. And I said, I will do my best. So I went, as I left, I mentioned to Ed Marlowe, and I never did this. It's very dangerous. I said, Ed, you may want to have a shakedown back there. And he said, I got you. And so they did, because what they did, they confiscated the knife. But I share that because I recreated Millard for the School of the Arts. And I also did a brief portion for Barter Theater. But it's not to glorify anyone. It's simply to show you a brief intro to the world of prisons and jails. Also, I love libraries, as Tanya knows. And so I wrote this Wake Forest Library. It is a cold blue February day. Through the downstairs window, I observe you. Backpack, cell phone, North Face jacket. Bend and pick up a dead leaf. Twirl it between your fingers, then disappear across campus. And I wrote that right after the Virginia Tech shootings, and that was what I witnessed that day there in the library. But also, there are a number of poems in this book. There exists an old green gold lettered book stuck deep in the shelves of the Emory and Henry Library. In the back of the book, the signature card records the names of only 2 young men who touched this book long ago. Before war, work, and women called to them, come and experience the future. Leave the old book on the dusty shelf behind the new computers that glow and Google all the information one needs. And of course, there's some tongue in cheek with that one. I'll stop there. I do have the girl in the green coat. That was my wife in Cholula, Mexico, 9 a.m. Maybe I'll read this last one because this is about my international travels. Cholula, Mexico, 9 a.m. We were teaching there, and I'd set up a program outside of Cholula in Puebla. And Patty and I were having breakfast there one morning. 2 teenagers in the booth next to us, French kissing, tightly holding hands, unaware of the American couple watching. The teens finished their Cokes, quickly moved to the parking lot, still French kissing. She jumps and wraps her legs around him. The gray-haired couple smile and slowly edge their fingertips across the table. All right, a little poetry from my book, Never Read a How-To Book, and I won't bore you with any more of that, but I want, as I said before, I want to talk about the shows that we did. And they're around 350, 300, 350. And if you go, all you have to do is Google Henry McCarthy Poets and Writers, WEHC 90.7 or Henry McCarthy Poetry, and these shows will come up. And there are many different people in there, and there are many backstories, and I want to share several of them with you today. But it's Wake Forest. I've had a number of personalities, including Tanya, who I think I was in the library looking for a first edition of Huckleberry Finn, but I got to know her, and we had her on because she gave such a good presentation and interview about what a library and what special collections are about. Also, Edwin and Emily Wilson, Michelle Gillespie, and on and on and on. And I mentioned this in my presentation, before. Edwin Wilson, as you know, passed away recently, but such a class act, and so was Emily, and such a great influence on so many people. And I remember when I went to meet Edwin, he said, "I'm going to take you to coffee." And I said, "Oh, no, no, I'll treat you." And he said, "No, you're doing me a favor." Well, obviously, it was a favor to me that he was taking the time. And then my grandkids got to meet him, and I've told those stories. And certainly, Emily was a great interview also. And so there are many others that, of course, that I interviewed. But the way we started, Poets and Writers, I was doing poetry around Southwest Virginia when I retired as assistant dean at Appalachian State. And they said they wanted somebody to do some interviews for WEHC, and they wanted somebody that knew something about poetry and writers. So that's what we started out with. And we started in a little radio station above the gym. It was almost like a closet. And then we progressed, and now it's a large 3-station studio. And Richard Graves was my first producer, and the second one, Ivy Sheppard, has come on, and Ivy is just outstanding as well. But the history, I wanted to do the shows. I did not want it to be academic. I wanted it to be poetry of the little people and writers of the little people. So we would get letters and poems from nursing homes. Oh, we would get them from just individuals out in the county. Some farmers and so on would send little poems to me, and I would read them on air. And then we started branching out. I had local personalities there in West Virginia, and Barter Theater's there. So we had Sean O'Sullivan, who had been a Broadway actor and producer and had produced the old TV shows like Playhouse 90. And Sean told a great story about the time. This was live on TV. You folks don't remember that. This was mid to late 50s in Playhouse 90, among others. And he said that they had an actor brought their Great Dane to the studio. And so they had it tied to the props. Well, again, this is live TV, and the Great Dane saw a mouse or something, and it pulled the entire set down. So I thought that was certainly an interesting backstory. Plus, he talked about many of the actors and the husband and wife team. I forget, it may have been the Harrisons, and how they were in the midst of going through a bitter divorce while they were both starring in Playhouse 90. So a little backstory. There are many, many other stories about around Southwest Virginia. The Carter family, some of you definitely know who the Carter family is, and that was AP, Sarah, and Maybelle. So I had their son. I got to know Jeanette, their daughter, and they are the pioneers in country music. Keep on the Sunny Side, among others. And Dale Carter, Jed, their grandson, who is a dear friend of mine, and has been on the Grand Ole Opry, but basically Dale is really a great singer, but he prefers to be a millwright. But I had Dale on the show, and we talked about how the Carter family, how they came in 1927 over to Bristol to record a song with Ralph Peer. Ralph Peer was the producer, and Jimmy Rogers came over from Asheville, the old Jimmy Rogers, and they all recorded there. And of course, they went on to national and international fame. Also, I love one of the shows that comes to mind is Earl Carter. And Earl Carter, he's not related to the Carter family, but of course he knew them and was from down in where they're from. He's from down around Kingsport. And he has a great book on photos. And he also was a photographer for some major newspapers as well as the little Kingsport, Tennessee Press. And he had a great story about Johnny Cash and June showing up outside the newspaper there in Kingsport, and they drove up and they came in, and he was in the back, and he heard this voice, and it said, "Hello, I'm Johnny Cash. Is Earl Carter here?" Well, everybody looked up, and it was Johnny and June. He said, "Well, we want to see Earl." So Earl was back in the back, and they came and they said, "You're a real good photographer." And June said, "We want you to take some pretty pictures of us." And Earl said, Johnny started to talk, said, "Well, we don't have much time." And said June gave him a brief elbow, and Johnny didn't say another word after that. So he took some beautiful pictures, and what he said was he kept them a little longer so it would give him bragging. He would be able to brag about it in the future. So, but Earl was real interesting. He came up to the studio, and and did his thing. And what I loved about him, he said he had a presentation over at, I think it was some other university in Tennessee, and said they didn't give him much room and they didn't even announce he was there. And I said, "What did you do, Earl?" And he said, "I just picked up all my stuff and loaded up and left." And said that was the end of that. He also was well known for a lot of his photography in the coal mines and the coal fields and strikes. So that was, I wanted to mention Earl Carter. And folks of you that are listening to this, I can't name all of you, Brenda Humphreys, Ray Roy, my goodness. I do want to mention the Peach Lady. And I know Tanya knows the Peach Lady. And Tanya, you have some of her books there in the library. And I don't know the exact names, but Belinda Smith Sullivan, I went in Dewey's Bakery here in Winston-Salem. And what I'm saying is I have a little digital recorder because I didn't know anything about recording. And one day a student at the station, I said, "Well, I'd really like to record some of these people on the road." And she said, "Well, Mr. McCarthy, all you have to do is go over to the bookstore and get you a little digital recorder." And that's what I did. And I would carry it in my pocket. So I went into Dewey's Bakery and there was a lady doing a presentation in there, and it was steering bookmarks. And I thought, she's really good. I'd really like to know more about peaches. So we went out to my hot car, and it was very hot. It was probably 85 or 90, and I rolled the windows down. And when she got in, there was a demeanor about her that reminded me of a pilot. And she opened the door and she got in and she said, "Check left, check right." And so I thought, wow, this is unusual for an author to be speaking as if she's a pilot. So we started talking. She told me her story. She told me about learning peaches from her grandmother when she would come home to Mississippi in the summertime, and she would learn. She was living in New York and New Jersey, and she learned all about these peach recipes. Well, meantime, she went on and she became a president or vice president of Pepsi Cola for International. And she also managed to get a commercial pilot's license. And she said, "I train pilots." So I thought that was a remarkable ability to multitask, to say the least. And that's one story that I share with you. Ben Montgomery comes to mind. If you have never read the book, Grandma Gatewood, she walked the Appalachian Trail. I think she's one of the oldest people that walked it, but she started walking it, I believe, in the early 70s. And I got Ben Montgomery on to tell that story. He wrote about her. She was a distant relative, and she'd had a bad marriage. And so when her children got grown, she told them that she was going for a walk, but she didn't tell them she was going to hike the Appalachian Trail. So Barter Theater has picked up on that, and they've now done a play. A friend of mine who's a great writer has written the play Grandma Gatewood, and there's a book by Ben Montgomery. Also giving you backstories a little bit, Charlie Lovett. He is local. Some of you know Charlie, and he's an excellent writer and has done a great deal. I think his father taught at Wake Forest, but Charlie has had several on the New York Times. A number of these writers, as I say, I started this program for the little people, but I ended up having Barbara Kingsolver on. And I've talked about Barbara, and she won the Pulitzer this year. But Charlie Lovett is a great story. We were interviewing him at his house over there, and Charlie also has in his lineage some Coca-Cola lineage. So anyway, I noticed there was a sign there, which I thought was interesting. I didn't realize at the time that I tried to get him to share the Coca-Cola recipe, but he claimed he didn't know it. But anyway, while I was interviewing him, he has Lewis Carroll's typewriter, and he's also a book collector, among other things. And I was going along with him, and we looked out the window, and there were 3 police cars out there. And I don't stop when I'm interviewing, and so I just kept going, and he looked at me, and then I looked at him. We later edited this, and my wife, Patty, was downstairs having a Coke, of all things. And the only thing, Charlie was just like, "Well, are they down there to see your wife, or is your wife all right?" And I said, "Well, I'm sure she is. Let's keep going." So we finished the interview, and the 3 police cars sped off. And as we were leaving, after we finished the interview, as we were leaving, we passed the 3 police cars at his neighbor's house. Well, lo and behold, in the Winston-Salem Journal the next morning, there was an article about 2 robbers who had entered this lady's house. She had hidden in her closet, and she had, I think was dressed for tennis, had hidden, called the police, and they had arrested them there. So that was that made an interesting story, and I was always pleased that we didn't stop the interview. And Charlie, we got a good interview from you. Other backstories I told you about, well, Pat Conroy and Quail Ridge Books, my goodness, and Nancy Olson and so on. She was so helpful in me getting these interviews. In most of these interviews, including Lee Smith, as I just show up. And if you read any of Lee Smith's work, Lee, we got to her door. Lee, this is in Hillsboro, and she looked at me and ran out. And she said, "Come on, Henry, we've got to catch Betty." And I thought, Betty? She said, "Yes, Betty, because Betty is hurt leg," and she got out, and Hal will be very upset with me, that's her husband, if I don't catch Betty. So I thought, if we don't catch this darn dog, then I won't get an interview. So we chased that Betty down an alley and back up on the sidewalk, came back up the street, and finally rescued Betty and brought her home. And Lee, of course, gave a great interview, as she is able to do, and we both are talkers. So primarily, I think we talked over each other. But yeah, Ray Roy, he interviewed me basically in a morgue over at Wake Forest, and he is an excellent haiku person. But I wanted to be sure and mention a few of these people, and mention the show, and mention Richard Graves and Ivy Sheppard, who were great at helping me get the show started. Of course, Beth Macy, I interviewed her up in her little house in Roanoke, Virginia, before she became so well known. And many of you know the book Dope Sick. Mentioned Eugene Wolfe, the great actor, has been on the show, and Eugene has done me a number of favors in entertaining and doing fundraisers for us. Jim Stokely, Wilma Dykeman. Jim Stokely's son, many of you are familiar with Wilma Dykeman. I did a two-part interview at her house right beside the little creek where Wilma grew up, and she played in the creek as a child. And Jim he's a Stokely, but that's Stokely Van Camp. And I'd always thought that Wilma had married wealthy, but Jim straightened me out on that, because her husband didn't inherit the Stokely fortune. And so they were dependent somewhat on Wilma's writing, as well as what their dad did. But Jim is also an excellent writer. And that was, I just remember the sounds of that creek and visualizing who the great environmentalist Wilma Dykeman, and interviewing them and listening to the creek. Also had some good interviews at the Black Arts Festival here. And if you've never been to the Black Arts Festival, that's great. And I've had a number of great guests and actors on there. And also, one backstory is I had William Cohen, who was former Secretary of Defense. He was there with his wife. It's an intermarriage. It was very well known. It was quite famous when they got married. And I think they got married at the Capitol. And his wife, who I'll get her name in just a minute, Janet Cohen, had written a play, and it was being produced there at the festival. It was Emmett Till and Anne Frank. And so I did some guest acting, and quite frankly, was only one of the white-skinned persons there. So I said to one of my friends, I said, "Who is that older white guy over there with the gray hair?" And he said, "I don't know, just some old white actor." Well, it was William Cohen. If you watch CNN, William Cohen. And so I talked to Janet, and I said, "I would like to interview you about your book." She was so gracious, and about your play. And she said, "Yes, and you would like to talk to my husband, Bill." And I said, "Well, yes, I would." Well, it turned out it was William Cohen, and our former Secretary of Defense read poetry on my show. So I was really appreciative of them, and what a class act. Of course, they waited for me after all the big networks had interviewed them, and they gave me their time. Shelley Fromm, he acted, my gosh, with the, some of you don't remember, Joan Rivers, the comedian, and Shelley Fromm was on. He lives up in Nashville now, and he was talking about how she got her name. And there's a long story there that I won't go into. But and then also the Boys of Walltown, I had them on. We were kids from out in South Side, and slipped into a lot of Wake Forest events and ball games. And we won the state championship at Ernie Ford Ernie Shorefield. So that's another one. But those interviews, if you want to know something about the interviews, you just Google it and the interviews will pop up. And Tanya has done me a great service by also helping to publicize this and to archive a number of these shows. So I'm sure there are things that I'm leaving out. As Mark Twain said, it's what to leave in, not what to put in. And I also do want to mention that Patty and I drove out to Hannibal, Missouri, and did a show out there with Henry Sweets, who was the curator of the Mark Twain Museum for over 40 years. And he told me so much information. And also, you feel that you're right with Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. And if you want to delve into the life of Sam Clemens, you will find it's fascinating. It's a real study in character. It's a real study, and Hemingway said, of course, that Huckleberry Finn was the greatest of all the books. So those are some of the, and I wanted to mention Teresa Keller, who really was a professor at Emory and Henry College, and she was the one that got me involved in doing these shows. And the first one I did, I came home and I asked Patty how I did, and she said, well, you sound like a cross between a country preacher and a college professor. So frankly, I took that to heart and wanted to improve on that. In the early shows, I was not adept at interviewing, so I would do most of the talking, as I'm doing now. But as I got better at it, I learned to shift and question the interview or the person I was interviewing and to draw them out. And they will tell you so many things. Robert Morgan, about his life and about not finishing high school, and then how he went on and he got a degree from North Carolina State and Carolina and so on. Robert Morgan, you know, you've read Gap Creek, and also Daniel Boone and other many great books that he's written. I'm looking down at all these names. Rosemary Harris, I'll stop talking about her shows, Poets and Writers, but Rosemary Harris, the great actress, married to John Ely. She was living here. Many of you remember her as Spider-Man's aunt, but my goodness gracious, she acted with Burton, she acted on stage and so on. So she really was gracious enough. I went to her house here in her backyard in Winston-Salem. I think she's now 96. She's living in New York, and I saw her demonstrating it when the writers had the strike. But Rosemary, such a class act. And so I got to interview her, and I gave her a copy of my little book, and I had a poem in there about her. And it was one that I saw Spider-Man's aunt today, and she said, well, read it to me. So she had me read several things to her, and she was so charming. And I said, well, Rosemary, you made my day, because I always wanted to, you know, act beside you or be a part in a play with you. And so she was just those two interviews I'm very pleased with, and you can Google those. Switching over, you know, I've had a varied, I've done interesting things in my life, as I'm sure you have. I didn't simply remain in the role as a university professor, which at times would cause me some difficulty, because, you know, if you're not, you know, you can be suspect at anything you're doing, particularly if you're out in politics and doing other things. But Appalachian provided me an opportunity when I was assistant dean to set up international programs abroad. And my determination was to set up programs that got young people. I didn't want to be their mother or father or tour guide. So I set up programs with them in China, in Mexico, Germany, Costa Rica. And the deal was that once I set them up, it was more like a Peace Corps experience, because they lived with the families. And I remember Ipotaraq, I put 3 young people out at Ipotaraq, which is out near Popo, underneath the volcano there. And Ipotaraq is a home for boys. And I will say that I was interviewed these. I put 3 student teachers there. And I have to say, the young lady taught me a lesson about, well, judging, I guess, because I thought she would have the toughest time. And she turned out, and it was a tough situation. She turned out, I remember, to be the strongest and the most, shall we say, durable in that experience. But we had experiences in China, for example, when I first went in there, and our son really helped me Hank helped me get access there. I went up into Shenyang, and you know, about food, food is certainly something as a common bond, but I made a mistake up in Shenyang. They had me down in this little cafeteria. They brought out the traditional Chinese food, and of course I used chopsticks, but I really wasn't in the mood. I had jet lag and I didn't eat it. So when I took the next group of faculty and students back, I said, now you're going to have to learn to eat Chinese breakfast. We went down to the little cafeteria and they opened the doors and the lady chef came through and she had Coca-Cola and French toast. And I was dumbfounded and I said, what happened to the traditional Chinese breakfast? She said, Americans don't like traditional Chinese. Americans like French toast and Coca-Cola. So I knew you would enjoy it more. So that's what I brought you. So that was a learning experience for me, and not to always be gracious, and which I tried to be in terms when you're traveling abroad and they serve you certain food. I read you getting into prison reform now. I read you Millard, which was the two-time lifer. And I told you about Millard. He was very interesting. Millard ended up dying at home in North Wilkesboro. And that's a fascinating story in how that occurred. The last time I saw Millard, he was on his hands and knees in the Bristol City Jail in lockup in maximum security. And he was hallucinating, but he said, there's some things going on in this jail that aren't right. And there's the authorities are on the take. And as it turned out, he was right. And the FBI came in and investigated the jail. And one of the officials ended up committing suicide and was charged with fraud. But Millard, through all this, he ended up dying in bed in Wilkes County. I'm not getting into the right and wrong and so forth. But I did find that most people who were poor went to jail. I did find that most people in jail did commit it. And they could also do some mean things, some good things. And one time I went to Washington County Jail, and these two fellas, overalls and all, said, farmer said, Henry, you got to help us. And I said, well, I'll do what I can. And I said, what'd you do? And they said, well, we just stole a couple of head of cattle. And I said, cattle. And I said, well, I will do what I can do. And I said, whose cattle? I said, I'll go talk to Judge Hutton. And I said, whose cattle were they? And they said they were Judge Hutton's. And I said, boys, you've made a very fatal mistake there. So they were shipped out to Richmond the next day. I don't know exactly why they chose the judge's cattle for that, but I did do undercover in Richmond City Jail, and did 3 days and 3 nights there, and that was interesting. And it was not the Boy Scouts, I can assure you. And I remember when I was first put in the paddy wagon and handcuffed, my charge was that I'd been selling marijuana. And my phony charge was I'd been selling marijuana up around the loop in Richmond. So I asked the fellow next to me, he was in handcuffs. I said something and he said, what are you in? You don't ask people this kind of stuff. You keep your mouth shut. But I said something. I said, what are you in for? And he said, M1. I said, possession of an M1 rifle. And he said, no, man, murder one. So I could tell you different stories about that. But I'd gotten involved in that because I was out in Oregon, and I gotten involved in prison reform out there and organizing migrants. And I was also hanging out with Ken Kesey's group, if you read the book, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So real estate. Well, I decided to get my real estate license and help my sister Rose here in Winston-Salem. She formed the first all-women real estate agency. And as she says, she wasn't being, necessarily feminist. She liked men, but she just felt like those 27 women were better workers. So Rose became quite well known in real estate, and Robert Helms and all that group. So I helped her several summers, and I never will forget old man Everhart, Court Everhart. He was one of the local builders. This is back when you built with all brick. And I was working one summer selling some of his property and hosting it. He came in, he said, what are you doing? I said, you're good at this. Why don't you stay in it? I said something, well, I'm a college teacher and I have tenure. And he said, what the heck does tenure mean? And he said, what does that mean? And I said, well, Mr. Art, Everhart, it means I can tell you to go to hell and there ain't nothing you can do. And he got a big kick out of that. But the idea was I did have a very good experience in real estate, and I did meet a lot of good people in it, and quite frankly could have made a lot of money in it. But I've always loved, working and teaching and so forth. And I mentioned acting, politics. If you go to Boone, it took us 3 times. I got elected to the Boone Town Council. It was about 85 and Boone was dry. And so we proposed that we vote on beer and wine and bring it into beer and Boone because they were all going to PB Scott's. And if you remember PB Scott's, well, they all went over there and there were great bands. And then they would get a few drinks and come back and get arrested on the highway. So we came up, that was not the really primary goal of getting elected, but I endorsed that. My mother and Rose and Bill and Patty and all got involved, and they hauled the students out of the dorms. And so that's it. If you drink a beer or wine in Boone, you can maybe think myself and Saul Chase. We also annexed. We also put the Greenway out there. And then I got involved with Jim Hunt. Jim's daughter is now running for lieutenant governor. And she is really out of his image. So it's our youngest daughter grew up around, all our kids grew up around politics. We would go to Raleigh. I was an aberration, I guess, in college teaching because most of them, were doing research and I was out doing politics. I have to tell you a funny story about the Order of the Longleaf Pine. Special Collections has one of the Longleaf Pine Awards, and I get a kick out of this because a lot of folks put that it's really one of the highest honors service awards you can receive in the state. And the reality is it's not the highest, but it is one of the highest. And I got a call from a fellow one time, said, I'm doing research. And he said, you have 2 orders of the Longleaf Pine. That's never happened. You're listed here. And he said, one is Dr. Henry McCarthy and one is Henry McCarthy. And I said, yes, sir, that's me. And one of them I deserved and one of them I did not. Jim Hunt gave me both of them because that's the highest governor's award. But one was purely political and one was for establishing internships in year-round schools across the state. So that was a little bit of the story about the politics. And I also ran for state superintendent. Bobby Etheridge beat me in the primary. Bobby was a politician, a very powerful politician, and I took him on in the primary, and he beat me. But and also I held a grudge for many years, and I love teachers. Don't get me wrong. And the NCAE endorsed Bobby, so there's a lot of stories about how we campaigned and how I went after them. I also didn't make a mistake. It didn't make me popular. I said I would freeze hiring at the state level and the state bureaucracy. But anyway, ran for state superintendent, and that pretty much takes me back to my family. All during this time, our family, Patty, and then we have Kara, and then we have Hank, and then we have Megan. She's the caboose, and she's still very active politically. And so we now have 7 grandchildren. So keep in mind, I share this with you, that we were able to do this, but we were always committed to our family. And one thing I notice I'm speaking from notes here today, and I'm not looking in the camera, so you'll have to forgive me. But the church, I grew up in Johnson, I was born in Johnson City, Tennessee, and the church was always a big part of our growing up. And it was more of a social activity because my dad was from the streets of Boston. He was Boston Irish. And my mom was Presbyterian from Roan Mountain up in the mountains. So it's quite a combination. But we always went to the church closest to us because he was legally blind. So we went to Calvary Presbyterian Church in Johnson City, Tennessee, and also the Walltown Presbyterian Church, Westminster, Walltown out here, and also Wake Forest. I have to say that, over there at the chapel, the Wake Chapel, I had a young lady, she drove me over there. We were dating in high school, and I went to Billy Graham's revival. He used to do a lot of them. And I told a young minister, female minister, that I got saved by him 3 times because you would always go up. And she grinned and laughed and said, yeah, but it didn't take, did it? So it was tongue in cheek, but I think she had a point there. But we always went to church, and that's where we formed many of our friendships. And that's who we knew. Little League baseball, sports, and the church was a big part of our life. So I want to thank Tanya today for allowing me to add some things to the presentation that I did at Wake Forest. And it's very hard at this stage of your life, or any stage, to conceptualize the things you've been doing. And perhaps this would belong more in a book. But I'm honored that Wake Forest would have the interest in me and would be make this available to you. And so this will go out to a number of my friends, and Tommy McCoon, I hope you're feeling better. The boys of Walltown, Michael Hogan, I didn't talk about interviewing him down in Mexico and so on. So there, if you want to go to Henry McCarthy Poetry, WEHC 90.7, you can pull all these shows up and listen to them. So this is Henry McCarthy, but before I do that, Tanya, are you still there?
I am. Thanks so much, Henry.
All right. Any closing comments or anything you want to ask me?
No, not that I can think of. Is there anything you feel like you haven't shared with the audience?
Yeah, I think as my friend, one of my friends who was at the presentation, and incidentally, that was such a joy, and to see so many show up at the presentation there on March 13th. But they said that they thought I gave more of a testimony, at that one. So, or confession, I think is what they called it. But I think I've talked more than enough. And as you know, on our radio show, as you know, you've been on, it's 28 minutes. So here's what I'm going to say. Thank you for listening. And this is Henry McCarthy, WEHC 90.7, Poets and Writers, saying, don't wait up for me. Don't be afraid to stay or still away. I'm going out to write a poem and watch the children play. Thanks for listening.